When true democracy goes away, people get hurt. It has real-life consequences. It's not some abstract political science question. We are all affected. And we take this for granted, and we can't.
Hi, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. I'm Jason Johnson, in for Nicole Wallace. A stark warning from former President Obama last month ahead of the midterm elections when American democracy was actually on the ballot. Although democracy did prevail in most races, Obama's words remain alarmingly relevant because the American experiment needs to stand tall on the world stage as a beacon of what it looks like to consistently fight for a functional democracy, especially as we're seeing other nations grapple with power struggles and the forces of autocracy. Just this week in Brazil, supporters of President Bolsonaro, who lost his race for re-election, attacked federal police headquarters in Brazil's capital. The attack happened after Brazil certified its election results on Monday and was the latest showdown following weeks of protests. The Washington Post reports, quote, some supporters of the right-wing president have called for the military to block leftist President-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from taking office on January 1st. Bolsonaro has not conceded his loss in the closest presidential vote in Brazil's history. He has not urged his supporters to fight the result, as former President Donald Trump did after the 2020 U.S. election, but neither has he done much to discourage them either. And last week, Peru saw its now former president, Pedro Castillo, attempt to undermine an impeachment vote by dissolving Congress and installing his own government. Castillo was then ousted and arrested. His vice president, Dina Boluarte, took over, but demonstrations have erupted across the country from the AP. Quote, Peru's new government declared a 30-day national emergency on Wednesday amid violent protests following the ouster of President Pedro Castillo, suspending the rights of the people to gather and move freely across the Andean nation. Protesters have blocked streets in Peru's capital and many rural communities, demanding Castillo's freedom, Boluarte's resignation, and the immediate scheduling of general elections to pick a new president and replace all members of Congress. At least 6 people have died, unquote. Meanwhile, anti-democratic forces in the United States continue to undermine faith in our elections. As the January 6th Select Committee readies its final report on the Capitol insurrection, the committee will host its final public meeting on Monday, where criminal referrals against the former president and his allies for attempting to overturn the election results are expected. As that's where we start this hour, let's bring in Washington Post congressional investigations reporter and MSNBC contributor Jackie Alemany. Also with us, Harry Litman, former U.S. attorney and former deputy assistant attorney general. He's the host of the podcast Talking Feds. And with me here on set is Miles Tanner, or our own Ryan Reynolds, as I told him before, former chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security, as well as a co-founder of the political party Forward. Jackie, I'll start with you. What do we know about what we could get out of this January 6th final report? What kinds of things are they going to have in this final report? Why are they making criminal, sort of referrals? Lay this sort of situation out for us.
Yeah, Jason, I think it's still a little bit of a question mark at this moment in time, as there are a few days left before Monday's preliminary hearing, and actually what's going to be the final hearing for the committee, where they're going to actually vote to adopt the final report and then make criminal referrals along with some other referrals. For example, they're going to potentially refer some members to the Ethics Committee for review, make some recommendations to the FEC to make some reforms to campaign finance. And then on Wednesday, we are to expect the actual final report. It's supposed to be 8 chapters long and is expected to largely mirror what we've seen in the public hearings, that sort of arc of the former president's attempts to overturn the results of the election, and again, narrowly focused on former President Trump. But that debate over what is going to be left on the cutting room floor is one that is still playing out amongst committee members and investigators right now as they do work to finalize it. We have been told that there is going to be a lot of information potentially included in the appendices, whatever is ultimately sourced to transcripts or any source material in the actual report. But we have also been told and previously reported that some of the chapters that flesh out some of the intelligence failures, some of the ways that Trump allies and Republican allies tried to fund the efforts to attend the Stop the Steal rally on the Ellipse and insurrectionists, and some of the research and expert briefs done and depositions with excerpts on extremism, militia groups, and sort of the modern path to radicalization for those people that we saw storm the Capitol on January 6th. That material is still in question about whether or not we're ultimately going to see it next week.
Harry, I'm curious about this. When I hear Jackie sort of lay out this report, it's almost as if, and I've thought this all along, that January 6th kind of did the homework for the DOJ, and they're kind of sliding it to them now. How do you think the sort of reaction is going to be? Look, the Department of Justice is going to accept this criminal referral. They're not going to throw it in a garbage can or something. But how does this actually play out? Do they give it directly to the Attorney General? Does it go to the special prosecutor? What's the process by which this final report is actually going to get in the hands of the men and the women who are actually investigating these issues?
Well, in terms of just the formality of transfer, I think it actually goes to the Office of Legislative Affairs at DOJ. But the big point is, you're right, this cache of information is, thousands of pages is all, and DOJ gets it not a second before the general public, which was an interesting kind of wrinkle. I think people have accurately said that, DOJ is going to make an independent judgment, and in that sense, it doesn't have a big impact. But I think also people have begun to realize, including on the committee, it serves an independent function in terms of the committee's reporting to the people what happened. And I think the latest, the notion that it's going to be not just Trump, but it looks like 4 others who were the sort of villains of the individual set pieces that they presented so effectively over the course of the summer and fall. It's important because it drives home to the public that Trump did not act alone. There were, as in other scandals, willing participants. That's a big part of the story to be aware of. So I don't think all of a sudden it has a thunderous when it lands on the floor of DOJ. But nevertheless, it's important for its own reasons, and I think the committee is going, along those lines. And that's part of what's happening with the point that Jackie made, which is members of the committee want to focus like a spear on Trump himself. Others want to put in some of these other things that are important, but in the overall theme of things may be secondary. And there seems to be a little bit of tussle behind the scenes on that basis.
So, Miles, this is the thing that gets me about this. To me, what else were we doing over the summer except watching the hearings, right? This is sort of the novelization of something we've all seen. If you gave me a book and said, hey, this is the novelization of A Christmas Story, I already know that Ralphie got his tongue frozen. Actually, it wasn't Ralphie. But the point is, this is something that a lot of people are already aware of. So what do you think is the political impact of this? I mean, the public's going to get to review this. This is not going to be as hot as the Starr report. It may be more interesting than the Mueller report. What's the political impact of once this is out in writing and the public can access it as well?
Well, I think the honest answer, and Harry hinted at it, I think the actual political impact is a Rorschach test. Right. People who are looking for concrete evidence to point to of wrongdoing are going to use this report to point to wrongdoing, and people who've dismissed the select committee the entire time are not going to open the website. They're not going to open the PDF. They're certainly not going to share the report. They're going to try not to pay attention to it. So I think that's the political impact. But I do want to go back to what you just said about the Starr report and the Mueller report, but also another congressionally mandated report from the 9/11 Commission. I think this is more significant than all of those. We can't lose sight of the fact that we might have a bipartisan congressional committee potentially making a criminal referral of an ex-American president or senior officials that were tied to him for potentially trying to overthrow a lawful election. I mean, this is a massively significant congressional report, but I also think one of the things that we're going to see in here is what we often see in law enforcement investigations, which is that people who did wrong are often going to get held accountable for bread and butter reasons. Basic fraud, basic corruption, those are the things that ultimately get folks in the end. And as Jackie rightfully pointed out, the things that are left on the cutting room floor are things that a future Democratic Congress might want to go back to, especially those intelligence failures if that doesn't make it in.
Jackie, I want to follow up with this. You said, as you sort of mentioned here, okay, things are on the cutting room floor. Is there a possibility that extra bits and pieces of this report, instead of being handed to the DOJ, they might go to local law enforcement? They might go to a law enforcement in a particular state. They may go to another agency and saying, look, we're not going to give this information, but this person, made illegal use of federal property when they printed out documents for the January 6th, insurrection or something else like that. Is there a possibility that the committee is handing out smaller versions of this to local law enforcement in order to get criminal prosecution, because we never know when the DOJ is going to do anything?
That is actually a really good question, and we do know that the committee does have their sights set on potentially recommending that various lawyers that were involved with the efforts to overturn the election are actually disbarred. And so that information and that evidence, while aired to the general public, it could also go to these local entities that would eventually proceed with what it would require to disbar certain characters that were, again, involved with the former president's attempts to try to obstruct congressional proceedings and disrupt the electoral certification on January 6th. People like John Eastman, though, have already been disbarred, so I think we could potentially be hearing a lot of names that we're unfamiliar with, local officials and lawyers in battleground states who had signed onto various suits and maybe engaged in unethical or criminal behavior that, the committee thinks that the DOJ might not necessarily take up, but that can be there can be sorts of fines and other punishment imposed in other ways. But I am very curious to see on Monday how much the committee actually turns over when they do make these criminal referrals. As we've discussed previously, the Department of Justice has been waiting for the mountain of evidence from the congressional committee. They haven't gotten that yet. And while it's quite possible that DOJ already has gathered a lot of this material and potentially more on their own, there could be still some stones unturned on their end as they've been juggling a lot. And I think they'll be watching Monday and the report on Wednesday as closely as we all are.
Harry, I want to play you some sound from committee witnesses speaking about basically just how corrupt this guy is. I want to get your thoughts on the other side.
Even his lawyer, John Eastman, admitted in front of President Trump that this plan would break the law by violating the Electoral Count Act.
Did John Eastman ever admit, as far as you know, in front of the president, that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
I believe he did on the 4th.
Did you tell the president in that second call that you supported him, that you voted for him, but that you were not going to do anything illegal for him?
I did, sir.
I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
Harry, when you hear that, it's sort of the supercut of what we heard over the summer. When you hear that, is there any way that the DOJ could accept this and sort of say, yeah, we knew this already, we're just adding to it? Or do you think the sort of re-release of this kind of information and this kind of testimony from Trump's old people saying, yes, he did that, we know it, we were there, do you think that lights a spark under either the DOJ or the special prosecutor to move ahead with this process, especially since the House has flipped to Republicans?
Yes, although I think the spark has already lit and is really burning. I mean, it's kind of a conflagration there to see what they've done in the last just few weeks since Smith has taken the reins of the investigation. So I don't think there's any lack of resolve there. But your point is really a good one, because there's some evidence that they've developed that the DOJ, for legal reasons, hasn't been able to duplicate. And when it comes our way, and then of course there's other stuff that they have that we don't. So we've just seen now publicly the whole, about a half of the Meadows text, and they are mind-bending and make clear there's some very willing participants. They presumably have or will get the other half. but there's no doubt that it has the same impact on them. What the doubt is has it already had that? Are they already hot on the trail? And, you know, it's a bit of a black box, but to indications they are, and it has.
Miles, this is the thing about this that gets me. I'm always very skeptical of saying, you know, the United States is the beacon of the world, because if you ask other people, they get their lights from other places, right? But it does matter that while we're battling with an attempted coup by a former president, you literally have a former president, Bolsonaro, who is very close to Trump, attempting the same thing in Brazil. You literally have a situation right now in Peru where the former president attempted to dissolve Congress. His own people, instead of driving him to continue his mission, actually took him to jail, and now you've got the whole country being taken over. What does it do to the rest of the world when the United States is embroiled in its own legitimacy battles? Do you think that has much of an impact, or are these just sort of parallel coups happening for no reason?
No, it has a massive impact. I mean, any student of history would see we've gone through other periods where autocrats band together around the world. You can look at World War I, you can look at World War II, you can look at the Cold War. This is what happens. Nation states band together with like-minded nation states. And also, Democrats with a small d and autocrats band together with people of their kind. The difference between this period and all of those periods in history is now their supporters are connecting online and across borders. We are seeing people on the far right, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Europe and elsewhere, connecting with each other, sharing tactics, techniques, and procedures to commit acts of violence. That's what's really alarming here. Now, I don't know if we've seen any evidence that there's those direct connections between far-right movements here and in Brazil and in other places with regard to these recent attacks, but it would not surprise me because these groups are connecting, and it's being driven also by leaders at the top. I mean, the sore loser phenomenon is traveling around the world and justifying these acts of violence.
And it's amazing how much buyer's remorse you sometimes see, because frankly, what you have in Brazil is a situation where the far-right candidate is saying, hey, I don't like this, I want to take over. It's actually, Castillo's actually a left-wing former president in Peru, so it's kind of a different situation. I guess the other thought is, do you think this is also impacted by the fact that, having seen what happened in America over the last couple of years, some of the right-wing movements in these states are like, they're not going to do anything. After dealing with what they're doing, we're no longer afraid that America may step in economically, let alone militarily, and shut this down. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, it certainly is. I want to go back in time, though, because we sort of saw this broadcast before Donald Trump even became president. I mean, Steve Bannon was out there very actively saying he wanted to go foment populist movements around the world. So throw out far right, throw out far left. He wanted to foment these populist movements in different places around the world. And in fact, at the beginning of the Trump years, the president named him on the National Security Council. And my former boss, John Kelly, had almost a heart attack about that. Now, fortunately, we persuaded the White House to pull him off the National Security Council so he wouldn't be in those sensitive classified foreign policy discussions. But that's what we're talking about here. And a lot of those MAGA figures are making their way back into different places in government, including in the new Republican majority in the House.
Most definitely. Jackie Alamamy and Harry Litman, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Miles Taylor is sticking with us for the hour.